Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Mordhau for PC. This is a first and third person action game, although I guess you could describe it as a hack and slash game if you really wanted to, developed by Triturnion and released on April 29th of this year for PC exclusively, and it's been something of a breakout success after having been kickstarted back in 2017, but even after it released, having gotten quite a lot more sales than they really anticipated, leading to a shortage of servers upon the game's launch, which wasn't really all that surprising given that they had about 25,000 people playing it on launch day, and that number has only risen since, so they've been working on getting more servers out there, and of course they also were working on patching up some of the launch day bugs, like, for example, the progression system not really working very well. For some people it was working, for other people it wasn't, and it was just an intermittent problem, but they have certainly ironed that out, and now everything is working as intended, with the exception of a few glitches here and there that aren't really that big of a deal anyway. So let's go ahead and actually take a look at this thing and find out what exactly we're dealing with here and whether the wait was worth it. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which in this particular case runs on Unreal Engine 4, and while it's certainly not at, say, AAA levels of production quality, they've definitely done a very good job with what they've got, and you have some very nice modeling, some generally very good textures, although occasionally they're a bit blurry, and the animations, while sometimes kind of slow, are generally very smooth and flow together very well. All of the equipment and clothing that you can deck your characters out in is period accurate and generally looks very good, and the environments themselves are generally quite well detailed on top of that, although there is an issue with the water looking particularly bad compared to the rest of the environmental visuals, so I'm not really sure what happened there, but it certainly doesn't look up to snuff with the rest of the graphics. But other than that, and a few slight glitches here and there with some of the animations and the physics occasionally, the visuals are very well done for an indie title, especially one with as small a development team as this has. Then you move over into sound design, and that's where things get a bit messier. They do have voice acting in this with regards to being able to select a voice for your character from several different presets and being able to adjust the pitch of that. And while the voice acting is certainly not phenomenal, it generally does what it needs to do, which is be basically a bunch of insults, battle cries, laughing, and pain sounds, and that generally works out just fine. Then you move on into sound effects, and they generally do what they need to do, and when you're in the middle of a melee, the sounds are usually quite good, but then you have certain oddities here and there, like the catapults, for example, which just don't sound very good at all. They sound okay when you're actually launching the boulders, but when the boulders land, unfortunately they make this really dull thud sound that just has absolutely no real impact whatsoever. So that can be pretty disappointing, and speaking of disappointing, the soundtrack, which I barely noticed at all, and even when I did notice it, it was bland and uninteresting. So that's really unfortunate there, but for the most part, they've done a pretty decent job to an outright great job with the presentation given the limitations of their team and what they were actually working with. But of course what really matter in a video game are the story and the gameplay, although in this particular case, since it's a multiplayer game that doesn't actually have a story, it's really all in the gameplay. So what exactly do you get in the gameplay of Mordhau? Well, it has several different modes, which are of course Team Deathmatch, which is very basic and straightforward. You have Skirmish, which is basically Team Deathmatch, but it's round-based as opposed to just having everybody being able to respawn, so you only spawn once per round. Once that round ends, then everybody spawns back, and you continue fighting. There's the Frontline Mode, which is an objective-based mode where each team is trying to capture different points on the map, as well as complete various objectives to help them deplete the enemy team's points faster, and once those hit 0, then the other team wins. There's also a free-for-all deathmatch mode and a battle royale mode, but conspicuously absent is a dueling mode, although I certainly wouldn't be surprised if they put that in the game at some point. And while the game doesn't currently have the dueling mode in its official rule sets, there is always the option of finding a community server that is running a sort of dueling mode, or at the very least has dueling rules in place so that the admins are going to enforce that. And that is something worth mentioning because a lot of games these days don't give you the option of having community servers, and Mordhau does. It also has every single game running on a dedicated server, which is very nice and means that everything is fair and all of the connections are pretty solid. although they did certainly have some issues there on launch day. Now once you've decided which mode you'd rather play, you can either use the matchmaking or the server browser to find a game running those particular parameters, although I would personally recommend the server browser because every single time I've tried to use matchmaking it just doesn't work, and a lot of people are reporting that the matchmaking doesn't work very well either. So that is something they definitely need to fix, but at least there is the server browser you can use, and frankly you'll be better off using that anyway. But let's say you've picked your mode, you've gone into a server, and you actually start to play the game. What exactly are you going to find? Well, as I've said before, this is a first and third person sort of hack and slash game. I say sort of because there are ranged weapons available as well, and those consist of bows, crossbows, and thrown weapons. And despite what a lot of people will complain about, the bows and crossbows are actually not all that good, and they are rather tricky to use. This is because the projectiles themselves are rather slow, they have a pretty significant drop to them, and more importantly, you can actually parry incoming projectiles with your weapons, and that just ends up negating all damage anyway. And as was the case in Chivalry, whenever you see somebody using a bow or a crossbow, then people just start complaining about that and say how you need to get good and you're a weakling and all that kind of crap, when in reality they're just complaining because they're garbage at the game anyway and they just want to vent. It just ends up getting really annoying after a while, and while I can certainly understand people complaining about the practice of, say, an archer trying to shoot into a melee and hitting their own teammates all the time, which is definitely very frustrating, what I've generally found is that playing an archer is rather difficult at best, and even if you are playing it well, you're really not helping out your team all that much unless you're playing an objective mode, and you're basically just trying to deal some damage to enemies so that when your teammates get up to them, they have a bit of an easier time defeating them. So if anything, the bows and crossbows are more of just a side thing and are included for the sake of actually having some ranged combat in the game more than anything else, because the real star of the show here is the melee combat. And this is where things do get really interesting, because a lot of people have said, oh, it's just Chivalry all over again, when that's not the case at all. Chivalry had exactly 3 modes of attack and exactly 1 method of defense. Your methods of attack were horizontal strike, vertical strike, and thrust, and your defense option was press the parry button. Mordhau, on the other hand, has a much more complicated combat system that certainly has horizontal swings, vertical swings, and thrusts, as well as a parry button, but it also expands upon those mechanics with something called chambering, where when an opponent strikes at you, you can actually strike directly into their strike, and that will not only block their attack, but it will send an attack right at them that they'll have to then deal with. And that takes a lot of getting used to, because most people are just used to, oh, attack, defend, attack, defend. They're not used to defend and attack simultaneously. Even trickier is that chambering in itself actually requires you to pay a lot of attention to what your opponent is doing, and you have to actually match what they're doing in order for the chambering to actually work. So if, for example, an opponent throws a thrust at you, in order to properly chamber that, you actually thrust directly into their attack. Or if they do a right to left strike from their perspective, then you're going to do a left to right attack from your perspective. And since the weapons themselves are considered physical objects in the game logic and will actually clash with one another, you actually do have this really interesting back and forth where your weapons are clanging off of each other, and if you're in a dueling context, that can make things really fast-paced and intense. But you can't just go back and forth on that forever. You do have a stamina meter that does gradually deplete as you complete attacks and defense maneuvers, and if your stamina meter bottoms out, if you defend on the next attack, then the enemy will actually knock the weapon out of your hands, and you'll basically be helpless at that point. So it's obviously best to try to find your way around an opponent's defenses rather than just keep chambering and parrying back and forth, and part of doing that is actually feinting and morphing attacks. Obviously a feint is when you try to swing but then you stop the swing before you actually complete it, and then the opponent is probably going to try to block and then you can just swing around and hit them instead. And a morph is when you actually start from one attack and then you go into another. So for example, you can morph a slash into a thrust, and vice versa. On top of all of that, you can actually also adjust the speed of your attack by moving in different ways. So for example, if you're throwing a right to left slash, then you can actually accelerate your attack a bit by actually turning from right to left. And of course, if you do the opposite and you turn left to right, you'll actually slow down the attack a bit. And all of these principles work regardless of which weapons you're using, whether they're one-handed, two-handed, swords, polearms, maces, hammers, whatever the case may be. All of the melee weapons have those same basic principles applied to them. So you can be using a spear and all of the same things will apply to that will apply to using a longsword. But the actual damage type you're going to be doing is a bit different. So for example, obviously with a spear, if you're swinging it, then it's not going to be quite as effective as if you stab somebody with it. Whereas if you're using a longsword, then that's generally a pretty well balanced weapon and you can slash and stab to your heart's content. Similarly, some weapons have longer reaches than others, so that spear is obviously going to have longer reach than the longsword is, even though the longsword has a pretty decent reach to it. And weapons that are bigger and heavier are going to be slower than weapons that are smaller and lighter, but they're also going to do more damage than those smaller, lighter weapons. So you have to keep all of this in mind when you're choosing whatever your loadout is going to be, and you have to keep in mind as well that there's not really one definitive best weapon in the game. It really depends on your own individual skill and how you actually utilize the weapons in question. The only real exception to that rule is the various peasant weapons like frying pans or pitchforks or whatever, which are generally just pretty garbage, and the peasant class is mostly in the game to be incredibly silly. Most of the weapons also have alternative attack modes, so for example with a lot of the lighter one-handed weapons, if you press the switch attack mode button, it'll actually throw that weapon. Whereas if you switch the attack mode on, say, a two-handed battle axe, you might choke up on it to give yourself a bit closer in of a reach. Or if you're using a longsword, then you'll flip it around so you'll actually start bashing enemies with the hilt instead of using the blade, which ends up doing more damage against heavily armored enemies. Or if you're using, say, a pole axe, then you'll actually flip the weapon around so you're using either the axe head or the hammer head. And each mode has its own ups and downs, so for example, if you're choking up on something, then obviously that's going to make it a bit easier to use in very close quarters, whereas it will actually limit the reach of your weapon, so if you're dealing with a lot of enemies at once, you might want to switch it back over to the wider grip so you can hit more of them at the same time. You also have to be mindful of what armor you and your opponents are wearing, because you have 3 different slots for armor. You have head, torso, and legs, and you can actually mix and match whatever you want in any of those slots as long as you have it unlocked. So you can either choose to do a full set of one particular type of armor, or you can do mix and match where say you have a heavy helmet but light armor on your torso and then medium armor on your legs, or you have medium armor on your torso, heavy armor on your head, light armor on your legs, whatever the case may be. And obviously the heavier armor you're wearing, the more hits you'll be able to take before going down, but that also limits what else you're able to carry because the loadout is based on a point system, and each piece of heavy armor is 3 points, each piece of medium armor is 2 points, and each point of light armor is 1 point. You can also go with just basic clothing, which has absolutely no protective value whatsoever, but it means you'll be moving fastest out of everybody, because the heavier armor you're wearing, the slower you'll move. So that mostly becomes a bit of a balancing act, because your points are actually spent not just with your armor, but also with your weapons and your perks. So different weapons have different point values based on mostly the size of the weapon and its general role. So for example, the big battlefield weapons are going to be much higher point values than these small items that you would consider more sidearms, like daggers or short swords. And you also have to keep in mind you're trying to balance all of that out with all of your perks as well, because perks also cost points, and some of them are very useful, like for example the Bloodlust perk, where when you kill an enemy in melee combat, it actually immediately replenishes all of your health. Now that may sound really overpowered, but for one, it costs 5 points, and for another, you really can't take all that many hits before going down anyway. Obviously you can take more hits from the smaller weapons, like say daggers or short swords, but if somebody's coming at you with a great sword or a battle axe or something like that, you might only survive 3 or 4 hits at most. And that's even assuming you're wearing all heavy armor. So even if your character is decked out in all heavy armor, wielding really powerful weapons, it's not like you're an unstoppable juggernaut of death unless you're actually just really good at the game. And to top all of that off, enough, there's no pay-to-win angle either, because even though the game does have an in-game currency and progression system, there are no microtransactions of any kind, and not only are all of the basic versions of all of the gear really cheap, if you complete the game's tutorial, which is actually a very good tutorial that goes over everything you need to know to actually be able to play Mordhau, it will give you 2,500 gold to start, and that's more than enough to deck out a single character in its entirety, or even if you're just going for absolute basics on everything and not going for any cosmetics at all, even setting up multiple characters. All of the perks are unlocked right from the start, so the only things you have to purchase are weapons and armor pieces, and even then, again, the basic versions of those are very cheap, to the point where you can basically get a single weapon or a single armor piece for simply the amount of gold you get by actually completing a match and at least playing moderately well. And as for the stuff that costs more, it actually affords you absolutely no advantage whatsoever, because the stats are going to all be the same across the board. So let's say you really like the look of Gothic plate. Well, it's going to have the exact same armor value as the style of plate that is the most basic version that you can get for dirt cheap. So they've set this progression system up for success right from the start. The only thing you're going to be paying larger amounts of gold for is purely cosmetic, and you're earning gold at a pretty decent rate anyway, so it's not like it feels really grindy to unlock the stuff that looks nicer. Now, some of the cosmetics are locked to various levels, so once you hit that level of experience, then that item becomes available for purchase, and I'm not really sure why they set it up that way. But otherwise, the progression system is actually quite fair, because again, all of the gameplay affecting content is available right from the start and for a very cheap price in gold, and it mostly just becomes a matter of picking and choosing what you want to unlock first. And even if you don't really know what you want to unlock first, you can always just pick some of the basic loadouts and try those things out, and maybe pick up some weapons in the battlefield itself and try those out and see what you like before you actually start to unlock things in the loadout system. And beyond the loadout system itself, you also have the ability to just scavenge various weapons from the battlefield itself, so if you don't like what you're using, then you can always just drop it and grab something else and try that out instead, or you might even just supplement what you've already got by, say, picking up a random sword that you found sticking out of the ground when you spawned into the map, and then you can just use that instead. And then of course there are the map-only weapons like catapults, which are only available on certain maps, or things like horses, which are also only available on certain maps, and which if you hop on horseback and you have a polearm of some sort, preferably a lance because it has the longest reach, but you can only find those scattered around the maps themselves, then you can ride around the map and couch that particular polearm to be able to use it for effectively jousting, but if you're going up against ground targets, then that's not really jousting. Regardless, a couched polearm attack is more or less a guaranteed kill, and you may think that that would make horses incredibly overpowered, but there's only one or two of them per map, and the person riding on the horse must actually be able to aim the polearm, and that's a pretty precise amount of aiming for a fairly narrow margin of error. And on top of that, it's not that difficult to knock somebody off of a horse anyway. On certain maps, there's also pre-designed defensive structures that you can build, and you can also use a toolkit to produce various battlefield implements like sharpened spikes that are stuck into the ground to help to deal with anybody who's attacking, or things like ballistae, which are stationary crossbows basically, and while they certainly do quite a lot of damage if they hit something, the trick is actually hitting something with them, and you have a very limited amount of ammunition with them. So they've actually ended up balancing out the game surprisingly well given the multitude of playstyles available to the player, and more importantly, even the stuff that seems like it should be overpowered actually ends up not really being overpowered at all. So that ends up making the game feel a lot more fair, and ultimately that means that the game really revolves more around skill than anything else, and that's something you really can't say about a lot of other multiplayer games out there right now. Now, of course, the game being very skill-reliant doesn't really excuse it from some of the other problems that it has. For example, it only has 7 maps in it right now, and some of those are only available for certain modes. So, for example, there's only 4 maps that are available in the Frontline mode at all, whereas for the Skirmish, TDM, and Deathmatch modes, you have all 7 of them available. But of course, more maps are certainly on the way, so we'll see an improvement on that front later on. And they're also working on sorting out the matchmaking issues that the game has and any other remaining glitches that are problematic at the moment. But even the flaws that do exist in the game certainly aren't enough to tank the experience, and if you're somebody who's really into medieval melee combat, then you're going to find that Mordhau has quite a lot to offer. And if you're one of those people who just went, ugh, it looks exactly like Chivalry, then not only do you have no idea what you're talking about, but you actually owe it to yourself to give the game a try at some point to see just how wrong you are about it. Because even with its blemishes, Mordhau is an excellent title that is well worth looking at for anybody who is interested in this particular type of game. And with them adding more maps later on down the line and maybe even expanding the customization options, I can only see it getting better. I give it a 4.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.